Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to Russia in Context. Today we're going to be doing another walk and talk. Well, I guess last time I was just talking, but this time I'll be walking. I'm actually in the Prospect Mira region of the city right now. As you can see over this way, we have the reconstruction of the sport complex Olimpijski. It's been going on for a few years now, and I don't know when it's supposed to be finished. I'm not even sure if it's on schedule. Don't really care, all things considered. It's got some swimming pools in it. That's not what we're here to talk about today. The last time I mentioned that upon returning back to Moscow from the States, I had kind of been thinking about some things that I had noticed and some things that not necessarily had changed, but I guess it was just comparing what I had seen in the States with what I experience here on the day-to-day. And I think more importantly, I want to talk to you a little bit about what I have for the last 5 years been hearing repeatedly about the States from Russian sources and from, I guess we'll say, English language sources that have relocated. Other YouTube channels, other English language YouTube channels that are sort of Russia-based or Russia-focused. And one of the first things I want to talk about is this idea that, like, of the Russian soul, maybe, or of the Russian personality, I guess, is maybe the best way of putting it. So ultimately, I always hear these stories, and I've heard them for years now, and I was fed all of this nonsense too when I first came over here nearly 20 years ago, of this idea of how Russians are kind of cold on the exterior, but then when you get to know them, they're really warm and personal, and they'll be your best friends for life. And I'm from the Midwest, right? Like, maybe we're just a different breed, I don't know, in the States, but from my experience, that's also not the case. What I guess I'm trying to say is that all of the people who are telling stories about how, like, oh yeah, Russians are so warm, and how it's totally different from, there's construction, how it's totally different from how people act in the States, that seems more like a personal problem to me. Because being back in the States, I never once felt like I was getting a fake reaction from somebody, right? When I would go into a shop or I would go into a restaurant and talk to the workers there, or occasionally if I would have interactions with somebody when I was going down the street or something like that, I never once felt like I was being lied to or manipulated, or that it was all one of those, like, fake smiles. You know, maybe it's a New Yorker thing. Maybe it's, if you're from Florida, maybe it's a West Coast thing. I don't know. But again, in the Midwest, I don't really feel that. And I would also argue that here in Moscow, there's a lot of people who also put on appearances, who do the fake smiles and they attempt to present themselves as something they really are not. They attempt to be more friendly than they really are. Not to necessarily say that's something that I encounter a lot, but I think what I'm really trying to say is that I've heard this myth over and over again of how Russians are X, Y, and Z, and how that greatly differs from Americans. And that's always rubbed me the wrong way. And then going back to the States recently and seeing that that's not really the case, because I encountered what would be considered like I don't know, like just good people vibes. I guess what I'm trying to say is Russians are the same as anybody. And really, in a lot of ways, they're the same as Americans. There's obviously some cultural things that are a little bit different, but in terms of how we interact with each other and everything with that, I really don't see a huge difference. So the next time you hear somebody talking about, like, how there's some mysterious Russian soul and the only way you can really comprehend it is, like, coming over here and being here, I would tell you that they're probably feeding you a line of crap. Russians are people, just like everybody else. Some of them are going to be one way, just like some Americans are going to be one way, just like some French or Italian or Chinese. Doesn't matter, right? Everybody's people. And we all have ways that we can behave. And culturally, there are going to be some things that are more prevalent among different cultures, but realistically, yeah. So that's one thing I wanted to talk about. It's honestly rubbed me the wrong way for a long time, and that just has to do, I think, also with the fact that anytime you start saying that a certain type of people is special for some other reason, I don't know, that seems like a slippery slope in a lot of ways. So that was the first thing I wanted to talk about. Actually, I have a list, so I'm gonna have to refer to it in a second. That, and the next one, before I get into the next point, I do want to swing our attention around over here. We have this nice old building. It's not the Armenian church, but it is an old church of some types. In fact, I'm on, I think, Shepkin right now. Yeah, Ulica Shepkin, and just a nice old street. You can see like lots of brick and whatnot everywhere. Lots of old, lower buildings. Granted, up ahead here there are some of those Soviet panel buildings, but regardless, that's to be expected. So, the second point I wanted to talk about was connected to the general atmosphere. And again, I was in Iowa and I was in Chicagoland, right? Like, those were my two locations. So, obviously, Moscow's a little bit different, but this is... I couldn't be everywhere, just like I can't be everywhere in Russia, so I can't give... We're gonna have to go with my limited experience on this last trip back. What I wanted to say was, in terms of just being out and about, there definitely is just a much different atmosphere in the States than there is in Moscow. And I don't want to say that that's something... The atmosphere in Moscow has changed, and I would say for the worst, and I mean, like, that's just, there's no escaping that, ultimately. Being here in 2018, when FIFA was going on, and even 2019, the year after that, when they were discussing introducing electronic visas for Europeans, there was a much more open atmosphere here, in terms of people on the streets, and just a lot of stuff like that. It was a lot more reminiscent, in my opinion, of what you experience in the States. And some people might say that's a bad thing. That's just a matter of opinion. What I have noticed upon coming back is that people are still out, and I guess I noticed it before, I just never really thought about it. People are out, people are doing things. You know, the rhythm of life in Moscow definitely changed after February of 2022, don't get me wrong, but within a year, especially within like the summer after the mobilization, people had kind of, the shock had worn off, I guess, and people had adapted and the rhythm of life had returned, but the atmosphere was different. You had so many people who had left. In fact, a lot of those people are, you know, with their businesses in that atmosphere, have taken it to other countries in Europe or even in the States. And so, yeah, needless to say, the Moscow of 2024, atmosphere-wise, versus the Moscow of, like, say, 2018 or 2019, is markedly different. And going back to the States reminded me of that old atmosphere in Moscow. Now, I'm not trying to shit on Moscow right now, although I'm sure some of you are already furiously pounding away in the comments about that, but no, ultimately just what I'm trying to say is that, like, it's changed. And I would have to say, if I had to choose between the two of Moscow 2018 or Moscow 2024, I would definitely can take Moscow 2018. That's not even a question for me. So going back to the States and being there reminded me of that time. And it just was, I guess, a mark of how things have changed. Not necessarily culturally, but just in terms of, I don't know, maybe an openness, it felt like. And again, this is Moscow I'm talking about, so maybe things didn't radically change in Ufa or Magnitogorsk. I don't know. But this is just what we're talking about. Beyond that, let's talk about one of the things I see brought up a lot, especially anytime anybody does one of those dumbass sanctions videos, which is just like the most smooth-brained, ill-informed level of English language Russian YouTube content that is produced. So all I hear again and again is how cheap it is here. And to be sure, if you're coming to Moscow and you're coming in with an American salary and you're converting that American salary into rubles, then yeah, it is going to feel a lot cheaper, especially in terms of like groceries and whatnot. But we're not going to get into the economics thing. I want to specifically talk about restaurants. So, and again, Chicago, the Chicago and the Chicagoland area is not as large as Moscow. So again, I get it. There's going to be some, you could probably argue, I don't know, you'd have to compare Chicago and New York prices, I suppose, how far off they are. But I know for a fact that when I was in Chicago, 4 of us went out for lunch, right? We went out, we had burgers, and we each had a beer, and the check, everything with tip, because obviously in the States you have to include tip, it all worked out to be about $100 with tip included. Maybe a little bit more, I think a little bit more. And I'm just thinking that if I were to go out with 4 people here in Moscow and order burgers and definitely get as much food as we were served there, like in terms of size of burgers and then sides, and then have a good beer, not like some Sibirskaya Korona говно. If it was 4 people, I'm assuming the check in Moscow would be, in terms of actual price, and if we were to convert it into dollars, it would probably be comparable. So, and this is something I noticed a while back when I was in Paris, and that is that in terms of restaurants, and again, Moscow is more expensive, so if you go to a smaller city, you're going to have a different, I don't really want to go this way. I'm just going to end up on Prospect Mina, and I don't want to go there because it's going to be loud. So we're actually going to go back, and back to the topic at hand. In terms of restaurants and a lot of other stuff, Russia's not that much cheaper than you would find in like Europe and the States. And again, this is my experience, but I saw the same thing. Like I said, I was starting to say, in Paris, 2 of us were there. We would go out for lunch, and we would have like, what would it be? A 2-course lunch, just like really good stuff, high quality, all that stuff with a drink, and it ended up being about 40 to 50 euros. And again, it's just like, you're not going to wait in the shade. You're not gonna get things significantly cheaper in terms of quality of food, quantity of food. They're similar. So the I guess the other point which I noticed while I was in the States is that things aren't necessarily more expensive there. I know I see reports all the time of how it's so cheap here. I see people talking about it all the time. But in my experiences, I just don't really see a massive difference. Next time I go out to a restaurant here, which maybe is next weekend, I will check back in, and if something has massively changed and I was way off the mark on this one, then I will let you know. But just realistically right now, I don't see that happening. And then yeah, the last thing that I wanted to talk about, great, okay, so now we can cross. The last thing I wanted to talk about, and this is something that I see brought up multiple times with, again, the English language, Russian YouTube channels, is how clean and how little crime there is in Moscow. And like, that's fair. It is clean. I mean, I don't really see much trash here. But then again, I don't remember seeing a lot of trash in Des Moines or Chicago even. And again, New York, that would be the one to compare, I get it. But all things considered, I just didn't see trash everywhere in the States. I don't know where these people are coming from. I don't know like which city has hurt them in that way. And homeless people also. That was one of those things. I didn't really experience any of that. I was in downtown Memphis too, let's be real. And Memphis is, well, it was last year the most dangerous city in the United States. I was out multiple nights in a row. I understand downtown Memphis, right? There's police out and there's things like that, but I never once felt unsafe. Even walking a little ways off the main tourist area, I still didn't ever feel like there was a threat to my personal safety. Didn't really see a lot of trash. I suppose on Friday night there might have been like a few plastic cups or whatever, but that's because bars were still open, and overnight most of that stuff got cleaned up and put in the trash. Homeless people too, again, I didn't really see them. And I know you walk around Moscow and you don't see homeless people either, but like, they're here. I think the problem is, it's just, if I'm going to walk around the center of Moscow, yeah, I'm not going to see homeless people or trash or very much of any of those things. But, like, I mean, we could go to Kapotnya or Ugreshskaya or some other further out part of the city where it's a more industrial area, where it's going to be dirtier and there's going to be more crime, and the possibility that the police have not pushed the homeless people out of that area is also significantly higher. I mean, like, that's fine. But I guess ultimately what I'm saying is, yeah, Moscow's clean. And, well, the regions that most people would go to. And, yeah, Moscow's safe. The regions that most people would typically go to. And, yeah, there really aren't really any homeless people that you can see. There's plenty of drunks, though, in the summertime. Not necessarily here, but I've definitely seen 2 or 3 of them before I started filming. But again, yeah, you're not really going to see them in the center of the city. That doesn't mean that these things don't exist here, but, like, you can walk around places in the States and have the exact same experience. I guess, ultimately, all of what I'm trying to say with all of this is, for the last 5 years that I was here in Moscow, and just sort of, I guess, first it was COVID and everybody was kind of locked down and there was no way to travel, and then a war started, you know, and then flights were canceled, and then just being here for so long, I slipped into that Russian mentality of batter down the hatches, hunker down, and just ride the storm out, and then things. But, and I didn't really ever think to, it's not that I wasn't in contact with people in the States. I was in contact with people in the States, and I never heard from them anything negative or horrible, that, like, things were falling apart. But going back there after hearing about how the West is falling apart and how cities in the United States are just full of, like, homeless people and garbage, and how things are so expensive, and how things are getting out of hand. Listen, I know I don't live there now, and I know, talking to friends and family, I know that things are more expensive and more difficult. But then again, it's the same here in Russia. If you talk to Russians, things have gotten more expensive. I know, I'm a nerd. I've been keeping track of grocery expenses for the last, like, 7 or 8 years. I don't remember why I started it even, but it has gotten more expensive. I found old train tickets from when I studied here, and granted that was 15 years ago, but the train tickets have increased by about 3 times, or maybe more, in that same period of time. I'd actually have to go back and check. So to pretend that the problems that are being attributed to the States don't actively also exist here is just foolish. In the same way that it's foolish to pretend that somehow Russians are different than Americans, or Americans are different than Russians. I guess this is kind of what I was getting at with the market video, which everybody, I guess, way missed the point on that one. Maybe they didn't make it to the last, like, minute or so, although they did hear the word pintos, so some of them did and just chose to ignore it. What I was getting at And what I'm getting at here is that there's really no huge difference between the United States and Russia. Yeah, there's a few cultural things, there's a few political things for sure, don't get me wrong, but in terms of how people live, Russians are more European in that regard. It would be foolish for me to argue otherwise, but I didn't really notice a huge thing. Things hadn't really changed in the States, just as things here haven't really changed all that much on the, I guess, personal day-to-day level in the last 5 years either. Maybe they have. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being blind. I guess what I'm saying is, even though I had been gone a long time, and even though, oh no, I'm walking on the grass, right? Somebody's going to tell me that this is illegal. Even though I've been gone for so long, and even though I guess even though I was unknowingly or unwittingly led to believe that things had massively changed, I didn't really see that things had massively changed, because they hadn't. And why would they have? I was always, I'm gonna wrap this up here. I feel like this is getting a little bit long in the minute count, but I was always of the impression 10 years ago or less that realistically, and I said this before, there's no major difference between Russia and the United States. In fact, I've always argued that the two countries are much more in common than we would probably care to admit. Maybe much more in common than the United States has with Europe, or even Russia has with Europe, for various reasons. What I want to say is, don't let people mislead you into believing something about maybe Russia or about the United States. If you live in the United States, recognize the problems and understand that those are things you can work through. If you live in the United States, understand that, well, I mean, yeah, Russia is, in terms of people, a normal country, right? They're doing the same stuff, trying to get by in the same way that you are. Russians should understand that America isn't falling apart and is not about to collapse, and that how Americans live hasn't massively changed, but then again, it's also not horribly different from how Russians live in the grand scheme of things. And that, well, I feel like Russians are usually kind of in touch with how things are going in their own country, but if not, I guess take a look into it. I guess on you. Chose a fantastic place to sit down, because now they are unloading the dumpsters, and it just smells fantastic, which I guess, but that's fine. There's garbage everywhere, right? Before I lose my train of thought again, and before I suppose potentially start repeating myself, I just want to say nothing has really changed in the States on a massive, substantial level, at least even in politics, but specifically in life in the States. Just in the same way that even though there is a war that was started in 2022, and it is with a neighboring country, it's, with Ukraine, that, for better or worse, hasn't changed the day-to-day life here in Russia, for most people. I mean, obviously some people left, a lot of people left, but it's another conversation. And, yeah, I had hoped to, I suppose, better collect my thoughts than that, but it's, I guess it's just, I had been, like I said, so under the impression that things were different or had changed, and it wasn't. It was still the same old states that I guess I loved, and I also loathed to some degree. That's okay. Nothing's perfect. Russia sure as hell isn't, and that's life. But I suppose next time I do a video, I will either try to better collect my thoughts. Still not fully used to this walking and talking vlog sort of format, but I think think it's getting a little bit better. Or I'll probably just make a video that's a video about something, and that will be a little bit more, what's the word, directed. So I hope this has been, probably hasn't been informative, but I hope it's been interesting at the very least. I'm sure there will be some fun discussion in the comments section. Keep it civil, right? Don't be a dick. I will just delete that shit, so don't do it. And I guess, yeah. Leave a like, subscribe, all that stuff. I will be back in the near future, but until then, this has been Russia in Context. Thanks for watching.